We're returning now to a publication that we've used a number of times in the past. This is Parapolitics. Parapolitics is a newsletter distributed by Jonathan Marshall to investigative reporters and political researchers. Marshall is currently the editorial page editor of the Oakland Tribune, formerly functioning in the same capacity for the San Jose Mercury News. In an essay in Parapolitics number 6 from the issue closing March 31st, 1982, Jonathan Marshall has authored an essay called The Business of Terrorism. And we're going to talk a little bit about the David Ricoeur mob and the collaboration with Klaus Barbie and the apparent extension of at least elements of that particular mob into the cocaine trade, and in turn, we're going to take a look at the cocaine trade's close involvement with U.S. intelligence in the 1980 cocaine coup. Reading now from The Business of Terrorism by Jonathan Marshall in Parapolitics number 6. The French connection, of which Lebanon was such an important part, was shifted to Latin America in the 1960s under the guiding eye of French and Italian fascists and criminals, including, as mentioned above, Tommaso Buscetta. Through Latin America, drugs could be moved with the help of corrupt governments and military administrations in the United States, evading tight customs controls or ports in the northeastern United States, evading tight customs controls on ports in the northeastern United States. The ring was ostensibly headed by Auguste Ricoeur, a former Nazi collaborator who relocated after World War II to Paraguay, where he was assisted by Nazi escapee Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who made his home in Bolivia. One of Ricoeur's closest assistants was Chrétien David, a former leader of the Gaullist strong-arm squad Service d'Action Civique that battled the OAS in Algeria and France in the early 1960s. SAC recruited heavily from the underworld, and David was one of those gangsters whose activities was sanctioned by the French state as long as he didn't overstep the bounds. But he was forced to flee to Latin America when, having been implicated in the political murder of Moroccan leftist Mehdi Ben Barka and in the shooting of a French police lieutenant, his political allies could no longer protect him. In Latin America, however, he kept in touch with his friends in the FOCAR network, and on behalf of local military intelligence agencies, infiltrated the Uruguayan Tupamaros guerrillas and fingered their leadership. Touring around the continent on an Argentine passport, he tried the same tactic in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. But David's real livelihood was crime, in particular trafficking in heroin. He was joined at the apex of the Ricoeur network by a former OAS henchman, Francois Chiappe, who, like David, now put politics aside. David and Chiappe were arrested in 1972 after the United States brought enormous pressure to bear on Latin regimes that harbored the traffickers. Interrupting, of course, we took a look at the hypocrisy in that pressure. That was the great heroin coup analyzed by Henrik Kruger. And, of course, the relationship between the people involved in that, the Nixon White House, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and the resulting right-wing terror triad, which Kruger calls the Miami conspiracy, we've just covered throughout the bulk of the broadcast. Continuing with Marshall's account, David was eventually extradited from Brazil to the United States, where he remains in prison. Chiappe, however, was mysteriously freed from prison by Argentine authorities just in time for him to take part in a military intelligence-sponsored massacre of left-wing Peronists at Azizia Airport in June of 1973. Chiappe became an enforcer for the right-wing Peronist Minister of Social Welfare, José López Rega, a P2 member, who ironically used U.S. military aid to entrench himself as Argentina's preeminent narcotics trafficker. One of López Rega's closest allies and the organizer of the Azizia massacre, Colonel Jorge Osinde, went on to become Argentina's ambassador to Paraguay, a nerve center of the French connection. The French connection, with its terrorist ties, lives on in Bolivia, home of the Bridegrooms of Death, a cocaine syndicate headed by former Gestapo boss Klaus Altmann, a.k.a. Barbie. Altmann, wanted for war crimes in France, is a close associate of Bolivian Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, who became Interior Minister following the notorious cocaine coup that the two men helped organize in 1980. Arce controls a fleet of private planes that he uses to move cocaine. He also commands a force of several hundred agents in the Special Security Service who divide their time between running drugs and torturing political prisoners. According to the New York Times, quote, reportedly aiding the colonel is a team of more than 20 foreign mercenaries from France, Italy, Belgium, Argentina, and other countries. Some of them say they are neo-Nazis. Last year, they helped establish and train the Special Security Service, which became the vanguard in storming government ministries and labor unions in last year's coup, in which more than 40 people died. That, from the New York Times of August 3rd, 1981, that's why it talks about last year. One Special Security Service trainer is former SS Commandant Albert von Ingelom, who served 20 years on a Nuremberg conviction. Other German Nazis from Altmann's contingent, 8 of them altogether, were arrested by Brazilian police for bringing 6 pounds of cocaine across the border. Also in their possession were a pair of machine guns and a pile of Nazi propaganda. So, the extension of at least elements of the Recor mob, notably Klaus Barbie, a.k.a. Klaus Altmann, is worth noting here. We're going to take a look at the cocaine coup touched upon here by Jonathan Marshall in this essay. We're going to take a look at that coup, the role of Stefano Della Chiaia in the Bridegrooms of Death, connections between that coup and the World Anti-Communist League, mentioned by Henrik Kruger, and the last thing we're going to take a look at is the role of U.S. intelligence in that coup.
Okay, we're going to read now from a book called The Nazi Legacy. The subtitle is Klaus Barbie and the International Fascist Connection. It's copyright 1984 by Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. It's written by 3 authors: Magnus Linklater, Linklater, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Asherson, Asherson. The Nazi Legacy. I'm going to read a little bit more about Klaus Barbie and how the Bolivian Coca Fascista connection was set up. Dividing his time between Santa Cruz, his elegant house in Cochabamba, and his apartment in the Edificio Jazmín on Calle 20 Octubre in La Paz, Barbie shared his views about the coup with a small group of neo-fascists whom he met regularly. To them, he would explain that their plan should be seen in a far broader context than just Bolivia. It was, after all, part of the battle against communism, he said, a battle which should have been fought 40 years earlier in Europe, but was now more important than ever. For the fiancés of death in Santa Cruz, the preparations for the coup, according to a former member of the gang, came with a visit from Barbie. Quote, "One day Klaus Altmann came to see us." That, of course, was Barbie's pseudonym when he was first in Latin America. "One day Klaus Altmann came to see us. Quote, 'The moment has come,' he said. 'We have to overthrow this government before Bolivia becomes another Cuba. With the other foreign comrades, we are getting together a security service. You have to cooperate. But first, you must be tested.' We began to follow the union demonstrations, to keep files on the opposition, to threaten and punish subversives. We worked well. We even had a private prison for the torture, which we left, however, to the Bolivians." Their political advisor was Barbie's lawyer, Adolfo Ustares, who used to address the gang with the words, quote, "We must kill all the communists," to which the group's commander would reply, quote, "Count on us, we are ready for everything." In La Paz, Barbie kept in touch with developments through a new friend, Emilio Carbone, Carbone, an Italian neo-fascist in his 30s who had left Italy rather suddenly in 1970. After a period in Spain, Carbone had arrived in Bolivia, where he started publication of a fascist magazine, which he also sent back to his old contacts in Europe. His connections with senior military officers in Bolivia were impressively close. Through the young Italian, Barbie began to learn more about the neo-fascist groups in Europe, their links with South America, and their somewhat tortuous ideology. The two would meet regularly in the Café La Paz, together with other contacts. Both men had realized that if the planned coup was to succeed, they would need expert help. Arce Gomez had expressed the view that they needed someone ruthless. Quote, "Bolivians are not hard enough," he said. In late 1979, Carbone was able to announce that help was on its way. Quote, "2 Italian friends," he said, "are in Central America. They will be here in a few days." Within a week, they had both arrived in La Paz. A young man calling himself Mario Bononi, and a somewhat older man, very small in stature, with a pointed goatee beard, who said he was Alfredo Modugno. Bononi, it emerged, was a 25-year-old neo-fascist whose real name was Pierluigi Pagliai, and Modugno was Stefano Della Chiaia.
Continuing with the Nazi legacy. There was little doubt that the 2 Italians were a valuable addition to the team. Both knew Latin America well, and they knew the right people. Delaquia's contacts dated back to Spain and his work with Lopez Rega of Argentina's AAA death squads. From 1976, he had helped DINA, the Chilean secret police, to locate and neutralize, unquote, Chilean exiles, and here, too, had gone into the news agency, unquote, business with a DINA-financed outfit called AIP, along similar lines to Guérin-Sarac's Agenter Presse. By mid-1977, he was so well established inside the Chilean security apparatus that he claims to have persuaded many DINA officers to wear the Ordine Nuevo insignia, the double-headed axe and its SS-inspired motto, "Our honor is our loyalty." In 1978, however, Delaquia had to move somewhat rapidly to Argentina. A scandal had broken in Chile following the murder in Washington of Orlando Letelier, former ambassador of President Allende to Chile. It emerged that the murder was the work of American-born DINA agent Michael Townley, a close friend of Delaquia, carried out on the orders of Manuel Contreras, head of DINA and Delaquia's protector. As Contreras' position weakened, Delaquia slipped quietly out of the country. He took with him the 25-year-old Italian neo-fascist Pierluigi Pagliai, who, like him, had fled from Italy after a right-wing terrorist attack. Argentina was a natural choice as their next base. The military dictatorship which had seized power in 1976 offered Delaquia in particular similar opportunities to those he had enjoyed in Chile, and he already had friends in Buenos Aires. But even so, it was not easy to gain a foothold. When they first arrived in February of 1978, said one right-wing activist from that time, they didn't know many people. They asked me to help them make contacts in military intelligence, unquote. A few introductions followed, but progress was slow. This was frustrating, for Delaquia had ambitious plans. He dreamed of making Buenos Aires a neo-fascist center with its military regime a model to be applied throughout Latin America. At the beginning of 1979, he began to travel visiting other right-wing regimes on a journey which took him first to Paraguay, then to the troubled region of Central America, already a potential gold mine for those offering, quote, security services, unquote. It is here that the threads of Delaquia's past begin to be drawn together with those of the violent present. For there is strong evidence that the lessons he had learnt in Spain and Italy, and which had been reinforced in Chile, were to be applied practically in Central America. The next step would be Bolivia. In El Salvador, the aspiring nationalist politician Major Roberto D'Abuisson listened enthusiastically to Delaquia's account of the men and expertise he could provide. He invited him to contribute his views on how the Salvadorian army should cope with guerrillas and subversives, and Delaquia responded with a paper written in his inimitable leaden style. The document, signed with Delaquia's codename Alpha, was included in a June 1980 analysis of the Salvadorian military from their private files of a group working closely with D'Abuisson. It is clear, on reading it, that Delaquia's views had not changed. The battle should still, he argued, be fought outside the normal conventions. And then they quote from the document, "The military operations of the armed forces now are more effective, and they are attacking the neurological points of the enemy, destroying important sections of their organizational structure. Finally, the Salvadorian army is making battle outside the framework of conventional war."
Continuing. Delaquia returned, full of enthusiasm, from El Salvador to Buenos Aires, where he gradually convinced the Argentine military that he really did have something to offer. His most obvious asset was his ability, through his European network, to monitor the activities of exiled opponents of the Argentine regime in Spain, France, and Italy. He and Pagliai began traveling to Europe in pursuit of their duties. They held Argentine passports and were paid by the Argentine military in dollars. Soon they were performing a similar service in Nicaragua and El Salvador, transmitting information back to Buenos Aires on left-wing exiles and passing on arms, equipment, and finally men for the Salvadorian death squads. Delaquia was an efficient recruiter of European labor. He telephoned his unemployed friends in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain and negotiated trial contracts which rarely paid less than $1,500 a month. Towards the end of 1979, Argentina's military leaders began to look anxiously at the deteriorating political situation across their northern border in Bolivia. Argentina was just emerging from its devastating internal, quote, dirty war in which up to 30,000 people had disappeared. And the military leadership was deeply concerned about Bolivia's trend to the left, a trend which could easily cross the border and refuel resistance to the military in Argentina. An Argentine intelligence officer, Major Hugo Raúl Miore Pereira, whom Dela Chiai had gotten to know well during his time in Central America, was appointed by the military high command in Buenos Aires to maintain close liaison with right-wing Bolivian officers. It was in Miore's fashionable apartment on the Avenue Libertador, It was in Miore's fashionable apartment on the Avenue Libertador in Buenos Aires that Dela Chiai first came into contact with a series of prominent Bolivians, including General Hugo Banzer. As a result of those meetings in late 1979, Dela Chiai and Pagliai, traveling in the disguise of the Argentine officers Moduño and Bononi, moved discreetly to Bolivia via Central America. They had come to offer their support in mounting the military coup, which Klaus Barbie and his friends were by now actively preparing. The arrival of Dela Chiai in Bolivia marked the beginning of a new and ruthless phase in the run-up to the coup.
Dela Chiai was now 44, his enthusiasm for the cause undimmed by his many setbacks. He saw the Bolivian crisis as an essential part of a right-wing movement which he hoped would roll back communism and left-wing governments everywhere in South America. Quoting Dela Chiai, "I decided that I had to contribute to the creation of an international revolutionary movement," he told a Spanish magazine interviewer in early 1983. "I was thinking then, as I think now, that it is not possible to carry forward revolutionary action in one country without a global vision of political events and a common strategy. So when the proposal of a national revolution presented itself in Bolivia, we were there, collaborating with our Bolivian comrades. We were neither torturers nor drug terrorists, but political militants." I would interject, take that last statement with a monstrous dose of salt. Also bear in mind this global vision of, quote, revolution that he talks about with Kruger's analysis of the Internacional Fascista, of which Dela Chiai was a key part. Despite this continuing here with the Nazi legacy, despite this high-sounding language, Dela Chiai was there to do an essentially practical job. Arce Gomez placed him in Department 2 to work alongside Klaus Barbie. Barbie was 67, hardened, and cynical. For him, the coup would be primarily an act of self-preservation, though he could argue the case against communism with the best of them. But he admired Dela Chiai's inflexible approach. It struck a deep chord in his old SS heart. It was not the first time the two men had met. Alvaro de Castro, Barbie's shadow and bodyguard, recalled a trip Dela Chiai made to Bolivia in 1978. Quote, "He came to Bolivia from Argentina with Pagliai," he said. "I met them with some others to discuss the possibility of publishing a magazine in La Paz." The two Italians held long discussions with Barbie and de Castro. The bond then struck between them was to last. Quote, "They were good people," said de Castro disingenuously. "We liked them," unquote. What Barbie was able to offer Dela Chiai when he arrived in November of 1979 was unrivaled local knowledge. He could explain the intricacies of Bolivian politics, the strengths and weaknesses of the security apparatus, and the importance of the drug mafia. Dela Chiai was impressed to find that the kind of paramilitary squad he had always used himself was already in existence, organized by Barbie. He set about organizing his own to supplement it. The hit squad assembled by Dela Chiai in Bolivia, like the Fiancés of Death, was an unsavory collection of neo-fascist mercenaries. In Dela Chiai's case, however, they were mostly Argentines and Italians. He called them, with a characteristic touch of melodrama, the Phoenix Commando.
The reality scarcely matched the hyperbole. Among the civilians, Mario Mingola was a fairly standard case. An Argentine who had tried at one time or another every religion, from training for the Catholic priesthood to joining the South Korean-based cult of the Moonies, interspersed with clandestine operations in Central America, Mingola had finally opted for neo-fascism in Bolivia. By the way, it's rather interesting that Mingola, this particular man they're talking about, happened to have joined the Moonies, as we will talk about a little later. Mingola had finally opted for neo-fascism in Bolivia. Quote, "We identified 16 international terrorists in Bolivia at this time," unquote, said a U.S. intelligence official. Most of them had been brought in via Argentina. The presence of these bizarre foreigners did not go entirely unnoticed in La Paz. José Fajardo, an eccentric Uruguayan bookseller living in the Bolivian capital, was sufficiently alarmed to attempt to infiltrate the group around Klaus Barbie in order to find out more about them. He then made strenuous efforts to warn both the Bolivian press and trade unions about them. Quote, "But they thought it was all too fantastic," he said, "and they never listened. I tried to get messages to Europe through visiting tourists, but it was like putting messages in a bottle." Fajardo described the relationship between the very different members of the group. Barbie was the moral authority, a sort of oracle and ideological director. He gave them advice and contacts, and he helped them organize their false documents. He was always careful not to be in the forefront of the action. Carbone was important for the international connections. He was a coward, though. They once gave him a rifle to hold, and he could hardly stop trembling. Della Chiai was the other ideological guide and a great organizer. He was a poor physical specimen, but very brave. His lieutenant, Paliai, was a real man of action. Bolivia, according to Fajardo, was attracted to the group for several reasons. Quote, "They had tremendous contempt for the Bolivians themselves, for racial reasons. They regarded them as something akin to the missing link, and they certainly didn't think they could build a race of supermen here. But it gave them a refuge when they were on the run. They could count on the corruption of the military officers. It was easy to get papers and easy to influence the fascists in the military."
In a bizarre echo of Che Guevara's analysis, they also saw Bolivia as a strategic location. If they did not stop communism there, they argued, it would spread throughout the continent. The Argentine military dictatorship provided essential backup, supplementing the Bolivian credentials supplied by Barbie with Argentine army papers. They also increased their military mission in La Paz to 70, including in their number several notorious veterans of Argentina's dirty war. As Bolivia limped from crisis to crisis in the early months of 1980, Della Chiai and Barbie worked intensively together. Over the next few months, the two men, holding regular discussions with Garcia Meza, Arce Gomez, and their military cronies, put together the essential ingredients for a military coup that would serve their common purpose, the restoration of a dictatorship in the fascist mold. A new element of terror was proposed by Della Chiai as part of the buildup. It was one he had learned in Argentina. Key opposition figures must be picked off early. They should either be murdered or kidnapped, always using unmarked vehicles. To avoid the hostility against a new regime that actions like this might attract, the work should be done not by uniformed soldiers, but by unofficial, unquote, elements, hooded paramilitary gangs. The Bolivians were not entirely convinced about this. There were diverging views about the form and degree of repression both before and after the coup, said a former associate of Della Chiai. Della Chiai argued that the enemy had to be completely beheaded, which meant the elimination of Hernan Siles Zuazo, Juan Lequin, the trade union leader, and the rest of the leaders of the political opposition. The Bolivians, on the whole, hoped for a less drastic solution. Della Chiai seems to have won at least some of the arguments. In February 1980, the office of the left-wing newspaper Aquí, a persistent critic of the involvement of prominent Bolivians in the cocaine trade, was destroyed by a bomb. In March, its editor, Luis Espinal, a Jesuit priest, was kidnapped and tortured to death by a paramilitary squad, acting, it emerged later, under orders from Department 2. As rumors of coup preparation circulated, there were conciliatory gestures from the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, General Reyes, towards the powerful trade union organization COB. They signed a pact to respect each other, unquote, and to back the elections planned for June. But by May, there were ominous signs of dissent. Garcia Meza, who had been promoted head of the army, described the pact, unquote, with COB as no more than a dialogue, unquote. By June, the atmosphere was electric. On June 2nd, Siles Zuazo's vice presidential candidate narrowly escaped death when the aircraft on which he was traveling was sabotaged. 4 leaders of the coalition group he represented died in the crash. The plane, it transpired, had been hired from a company owned by Arce Gomez. We're going to take a break at this point and play a little more music. Then we're going to come back, read you about the coup d'etat itself, and then we're going to cover the United States' role in that coup.
Indeed. So we will be back in just a few minutes with more of Radio Free America with Dave Emery and myself, Nip Tuck. Don't go away. We've got it coming up for you right here on KFJC. And with that, we return. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emery in the studios at KFJC. And for the last home stretch, here of Radio Free America for this evening, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. We're going to go back to the book The Nazi Legacy by Magnus Linklater, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Ascherson. And you'll bear with me. I'm having trouble talking tonight, folks, but we'll try and make this as clear as possible, and we'll explicate some of this stuff near the end of the broadcast, and we've already ID'd, so everything else is copacetic, and we can move on from here. We've been talking about the Bolivian coup d'etat, which is highly significant for a variety of reasons, but not least for which it's one of the purest examples of the drug Nazis in action, available for scrutiny. And of course, Klaus Barbie is supposedly may actually finally go to trial this spring. I will believe it when I see it. So this is also very current news, since it was the fall of the Coca Fascista regime in Bolivia that we're reading about its inception right now. It was the fall of that regime that allowed Klaus Barbie to be in a situation where he could finally be extradited to France to stand trial for his crimes as the Butcher of Lyon when he was the Gestapo commander. Anyway, reading from The Nazi Legacy. They moved on July 17th, 1980. At dawn that day, Bolivians woke to the announcement of a military rising in Trinidad, the capital of the Beni, where mutinying soldiers were calling for Colonel Luis Arce Gomez to, quote, lead a national revolution. The 189th coup in Bolivia's history had begun. As the news came through, an emergency meeting was called in La Paz at the headquarters of the trade union organization COB. Key members of the Committee for the Defense of Democracy assembled, along with trade union and human rights leaders, among them Marcelo Quiroga Santa Cruz, a primary target for the coup leaders. What happened next was a grim demonstration of Dela Chiai's strategy. He was later to boast that the bloody events at the COB headquarters that day were not only supervised by him, but that he took part himself in the killing. According to Ministry of the Interior sources, the plans for the raid and the attacks on radio stations that day had been devised by a small group consisting of Barbie, Dela Chiai, and Paliai, with a Bolivian officer, Guido Benavides, acting as liaison. Those plans had been directed from Department 2 of the Army, but Dela Chiai was later to boast that he took a personal hand in the COB raid. At 10:30 a.m., news reached the COB meeting that the main square in Santa Cruz had been taken by the rebels and that military units in Cochabamba had joined the coup. Quiroga quickly proposed a general strike, a proposition unanimously accepted. As the strike call was being drafted for immediate release to the radio stations, the sound of automatic fire outside interrupted the debate. Inside the COB building, it was at first assumed that the firing was meant simply to intimidate. But this coup was different. As the windows began to shatter, the members realized they were under attack. Noel Vasquez, an official of the COB, remembers what happened then. Quote, "We all hit the floor. Moments later, they burst in, hooded civilians with automatic weapons. They were very ferocious. They ordered us outside. They took the leaders out first, and as we were going downstairs, one of them ordered Marcelo, Quiroga, to stay behind. He refused, but they pushed the others out in front and fired a burst of automatic fire at him. They killed another comrade, too. I saw his body in the angle of the stairs, with Marcelo lying on top of him. I lifted Marcelo's head, and he was still alive but bleeding heavily. Later we heard he was dead." Unquote. What happened next bears all the characteristics of the brutal tactics Dela Chiai had been proposing to his Bolivian hosts. The survivors of the COB raid were taken to the headquarters of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where they were beaten and tortured. The women among them were repeatedly raped. From Army headquarters, the group was taken to the offices of the secret police, and a week of torture and beating followed. Quote, "We spent days in a cement cell without food, living in our own excrement," said Vasquez. "We were tortured by hooded paramilitaries with Italian or Argentine accents." As the COB leadership was led captive away, steps were taken to crush the strike. An armed paramilitary squad launched a heavy attack on a Catholic radio station, Radio Fides, and silenced it. Over the next 24 hours, about 20 trade union leaders were to die, while the leaders of the Peasants' Union, Simón Reyes, was so brutally tortured that he never walked again. The strike call was effective only in the mines, where some miners held out for 2 weeks, but with its leaders rounded up or killed, resistance crumbled.
In Santa Cruz, things went equally smoothly. Barbie's lawyer Ustares organized Feeblecorn's gang, now impressively renamed the Special Commando Group, to which he had recently presented an armored car. Quote, "The day of the coup was not very laborious," he said, a former member of the group. "Our job was supposed to be to take the revolutionaries' positions with the assault car. We were destined for important positions, not very bloody ones, and we didn't have to use the assault car," unquote. Ustares' armored car did, however, feature that day. The group took a commemorative photograph in front of it, dressed in battle fatigues and holding automatic weapons. Strung across the car was a banner reading, "Long live Free Bolivia," and prominent in the black row, dressed in battle fatigues, an ammunition belt strapped round his waist and submachine gun in his hand, was Ustares himself. July 17th had gone well for the ringleaders of the coup. By the end of the day in La Paz, the presidential palace and the university were under military control, and every radio station but that of the army was silenced. Outside the capital, the miners' radios continued for a few days until they too were attacked. On July 22nd, the Union leader Juan Lequin, captured in the first assault on COB, went on television to call off further resistance as useless. Garcia Meza, who had supervised the initial rebellion in Trinidad, returned to La Paz for the swearing-in of the junta on July 18th. Sporadic resistance continued, in spite of more than 500 detentions in the first 24 hours, but over the next few days, massive arrests mopped up those who would not manage to reach the security of a foreign embassy or go underground. In operations reminiscent of the Chilean coup of 1973, detainees were herded into sports stadia, from where selected groups were taken out and shot. On July 18th, with the borders closed and the country declared a military zone, the coup had, in the short term at least, been a success. For the citizens, things looked less encouraging. "It became clear who was helping very quickly," recalled one Bolivian. "I was watching television and suddenly found myself watching a string of Argentine soap operas. The shooting was still going on in the streets," unquote. One diplomat said, "Overnight it became the weirdest place imaginable, with creeps with carbines running around and everybody normal off the streets. It was as though the mafia had taken over in downtown Washington," unquote. I would interject, that's a lot closer to the truth, perhaps, than he may have guessed at the time. Continuing with the account in the Nazi legacy. The famous Argentine technique of making people disappear into innocent-looking vehicles was much in evidence. "For a while," said a young Bolivian student, "every time you saw an ambulance, you ran like hell." The exact number who disappeared is unknown, but one estimate put the dead by mid-August at 500 and the wounded at 2,000.
With Garcia Meza installed as president, Arce Gomez became Minister of the Interior and ran the country's security machine. A law of national security was introduced, giving him swinging powers, and he set an unmistakable stamp on the new regime when he announced, quote, "All those who violate the law will have to walk around with their last will and testament under their arm," unquote. Meanwhile, the coup had left the little team in Department 2 in privileged positions. Barbie and the Italians were given command functions in state security under the new Minister of the Interior. Barbie himself, with the rank of honorary colonel in the Bolivian army, continued to supervise internal intelligence. Alvaro de Castro was suddenly to be seen at the airport, monitoring the arrival and departure of interesting foreigners. Mario Mingola became an advisor to Department 2 in psychological operations. From his room in the Sheraton, he would indulge his taste for disguise, his passion being to infiltrate potential resistance and report on dissent. Paliai worked directly under Barbie, specializing in disinformation. Skipping down. Delaquiai was assigned the task of winning back some international support. He was quick to show off his new credentials. On September 2nd, he traveled to Buenos Aires for the opening of the 4th Congress of the Latin American Anti-Communist League, accompanied by Garcia Meza's personal delegate. There he arranged several meetings at the Hotel Plaza between Major Dabuisson of El Salvador and senior Bolivians, at which Dabuisson sought and obtained their help in sending weapons and money to his, quote, anti-guerrilla forces. Dabuisson was impressed by the advice he received from Delaquiai and his comrades. Quote, "They are professionals," said one Salvadorian who went to Buenos Aires with him. "They can teach the Guardia Nacional how to do things." In October, Delakiai was given an advance of $50,000 with which he traveled to Lausanne in Switzerland to set up the Europe-Bolivia Association, followed later by branches in Paris, Rome, and Madrid. Back in Bolivia, the death squads were in operation, and there was a more or less permanent curfew in La Paz. Barbie, Delakiai, Paliai, De Castro, and the rest of their associates carried special credentials from the Ministry of the Interior, which permitted them to operate after the curfew hours. If an overzealous Bolivian patrol made a mistake, they quickly paid for it. Jose Fajardo remembered one such incident when Paliai's brother-in-law was arrested by a Bolivian patrol after curfew hours. He instructed the patrol to drive to the house of the Argentine military attaché, where Paliai himself came out with a pistol in both hands, and an Argentine behind him with a submachine gun. "Stinking Indians, Bolivian scum," he screamed at them in the authentic tones of the fascist. "How dare you arrest my brother-in-law?" The Bolivians melted away. But there was more than just privileges to enjoy. There was big money. As the internal repression continued, the conspirators moved swiftly to profit from their victory and to bleed the drug business. Quote, "For the first time in history," one U.S. official remarked, "the cocaine trade has bought itself a government." The principle under which Garcia Meza intended to operate was laid down at a meeting in the Ministry of the Interior towards the end of 1980. Klaus Barbie summoned Joaquin Fiebelkorn and two of the fiancés of death, Kuhlman and Koplan, to attend. The minister, he told them, had something important to discuss. Arce Gomez handed Fiebelkorn a list of 140 of the smaller Santa Cruz dealers who were to be, quote, suppressed. None of the 5 big drug barons, including Roberto Suarez, was on the list. Quote, "The generals were no longer satisfied with a percentage of the trade," said one of the fiancés later. Quote, "They wanted to control the business. The government wanted to begin a clear-out of the small and medium-sized pasta dealers so that they could concentrate on the big ones afterward."
This using the government alleged narcotics enforcement, the elements of the government supposedly to control the narcotics trade, was in fact used to eliminate the competition here for the bigger people, and that, of course, is very reminiscent of the great heroine coup as postulated by Henrik Kruger. Continuing. Once again, Barbie was in control of the squad, handing down instructions to Fiebelkorn and reporting back on the activities of the fiancés to Arce Gomez. Increasingly, as the group became more arrogant, he found himself relaying horror stories about their excesses. A monster had been created which would be hard to tame again, but Arce Gomez was untroubled. The monster was making him a great deal of money. Licenses to transport the coca leaf, available only from the Ministry of the Interior, cost $1,500. For a plane to take off unmolested by the authorities could cost $30,000. And of course, there were direct profits to be gleaned from that section of the traffic which Arce Gomez and Garcia Meza controlled directly. There was more than enough for everybody, as a member of the gang remembered. The Garcia Meza regime put us into the money. We transferred our general barracks to a building near the airport, surrounded by trees and a 2-meter cement wall. On the terrace, we installed 2 machine guns. The generals in the government had decided to take the drug traffic into their own hands, going round the dealers and intermediaries. It was a big affair, $2,000 million worth. In November, playing out his public role, Arce Gomez announced publicly that drug trafficking in Bolivia would be punishable by the death penalty under a forthcoming internal security law. More secretly, in the course of another meeting in La Paz, Garcia Meza told the fiancé leadership, quote, "We have to operate in a convincing manner," unquote. The key to Garcia Meza's plan lay in a secret report headed Plan 001-FRGE, an unassuming, plain white document prepared for him by, quote, Special Intelligence Group No. 2 of the Army. It is clear from the criticisms it contains of Department 2 that this remarkable document was prepared by a rival section within Arce Gomez's organization, but some of its warnings about the excesses of the fiancés echo precisely what Barbie had already begun to pass on to the minister. The report began, "Fulfilling your instructions, Colonel Camacho, a senior intelligence officer, put the Special Intelligence Group in touch with the principal exporters of cocaine. The great majority of those interviewed showed great enthusiasm for your Excellency's plan. In order that we might perfect the plan, they facilitated visits for us to several factories that we might observe the various processes and gave us samples of the finished product. The report is a fascinating and detailed account of the business conducted by the major traffickers, the favored and most profitable export routes, the maximum tax that the traffickers would pay in protection money, and the problems the traffickers currently faced. High on the list were the excessive demands for protection money from government officials. These should be controlled, said the report. For the success of the plan, the exporters consider essential to the suppression of individual and workshop production. It is necessary to guarantee the functioning of industrial plants which have a capacity of 5,000 kilos a month. This was the task assigned to the fiancés of death. All the cocaine seized was to be handed over to the Ministry of the Interior. The rest of the confiscated property could be counted spoils of war. And as Joachim Fiebelkorn later testified in the course of his Frankfurt trial, the man who ensured that the special police passes were issued and who ironed out any problems that arose was Klaus Barbie. He was also responsible for paying the fiancés, which he did every month, using a Major Luis Cosio as the go-between. Cosio had once worked for the Drug Suppression Agency, but had switched sides, so he was a useful and knowledgeable intermediary. The leaders of the fiancés returned from their meeting with Garcia Meza in high spirits and threw a party in Santa Cruz. Fiebelkorn was splendid in his SS uniform, recalled one member of the group. The women from the Women's and Mothers National Front gave us flowers. The party ended with shouts of Heil Hitler. So basically, we've seen how the government, basically, as one official put it, the cocaine trade had bought itself a government, and we're now going to take a look at the U.S. government's role in promoting that coup.
And one of the contact points, and a rather interesting one, between the U.S. government and Bolivia was through the filter of the Unification Church of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Strange stuff, but then again, regular listeners know that strange stuff is what to expect. All of it documented. This is from an article in the Covert Action Information Bulletin. This is bulletin number 25, originally published in, I believe, winter 1986. Covert Action Information Bulletin number 25 from winter of 86. The article itself, the entire article, and I just lost the front page, is called Klaus Barbie, A Killer's Career. It's by Kai Herman, copyright 1984. And this is in the middle of the article after talking about the coup itself and the cries of Heil Hitler as the rightists took power. The first official well-wisher who visited the newly inaugurated President Garcia was a surprise, at least for outsiders. He was the acting leader of the Moonies, Colonel Bo Hee Pak. And for those of you not familiar, it's 3 words, 3 names, B-O-H-I-P-A-K. The representative of the sect's founder, Moon, announced after his return to the U.S., quote, "I have erected a throne for Father Moon in the world's highest city." According to the legally recognized assessment of 4 clergymen from Hessen, a West German state, the Moon sect is a, quote, criminal union that espouses human psychological terror and proclaims a fascist system, unquote. The Moon sect possesses, among other things, munition factories in South Korea and television channels in South America. They regard their founder, Moon, as, quote, Holy Father, and President Reagan as the world's, quote, political savior. A representative of the Moon sect had come to Bolivia at the end of the 1960s. On the 13th floor of the Jazmín building in La Paz, an Asian named Harumiko Iwasawa sat with some Americans, and no one seemed to know what they were actually doing there. It was not until 1983 that the Bolivian Ministry of the Interior and Bolivian journalists determined that the gentlemen from the Moon sect, as well as others, had invested about $4 million into the preparation of the coup. Membership lists of the political Moon organization Causa were found. At the top of the list were the names of almost all the leading military personnel who, at the same time, had been honoring the swastika in Barbie's lodge. Even junta leader Garcia had been converted to the Moonies for a time. Barbie was skeptical of the sect's activities, but had to accept the Moon people as allies. On May 31st, 1981, 9 months after the cocaine general's coup, almost the entire leadership of the Moon sect and their Latin American political organization Causa flew to La Paz. Before 200 invited guests in the Sheraton Hotel's Hall of Freedom, Moon's representative Colonel Pak and the Bolivian junta leader Garcia began by praying for U.S. President Reagan, who had been wounded in an assassination attempt. Pak then explained, quote, God has chosen the Bolivian people in the heart of South America as the ones to conquer communism, unquote. The Moon Organization Causa started their political missionary work throughout the entire country. 50,000 of the sect's books, according to a Bolivian intelligence agency report, were brought to La Paz by an American Air Force plane. Let me read that again. The Moon Organization Causa started their political missionary work throughout the entire country. 50,000 of the sect's books, according to a Bolivian intelligence agency report, were brought to La Paz by an American Air Force plane. Along with ideological, quote, enlightenment, the education of an anti-communist People's Army for a, quote, armed church began. Around 7,000 Bolivians took part in the pre-military training. The Israeli embassy supported the campaign and delivered, among other things, instructional films about the fight against the Palestinian resistance. The leader of the Moon Group in Bolivia was Thomas "Tom" Ward. Barbie and the pale American Ward, who always seemed to be absorbed in prayer, were often seen together. Tom Ward was also the man who delivered a payment from the CIA in early 1981 to the Argentinian intelligence lieutenant Alfredo Mingolla, M-I-N-G-O-L-L-A. The $1,500 monthly salary for Mingolla was paid in the Causa office belonging to William Selig, Ward's representative. Selig put less stock in pious attitudes than his boss. He was an electronics specialist with experience in Vietnam and advised the Bolivian intelligence organization on technical matters. The third man in the CIA cadre of the Moonies was Paul Perry, who had already tried to organize a, quote, armed church in Brazil. The Argentinian agent Alfredo Mingolla at first knew little about the connection between the Nazi Barbie and the Moonie Ward. 2 days after his recruitment by the CIA, says Mingolla, he met the old German, unquote, in the courtyard of the Bolivian General Staff. Mingolla came out of Department 7 of the intelligence agency. Barbie came out of Department 3. La Paz, Barbie shared his views about the coup with a small group of neo-fascists whom he met regularly. To them, he would explain that their plan should be seen in a far broader context than just Bolivia. It was, after all, part of the battle against communism, he said, a battle which should have been fought 40 years earlier in Europe, but was now more important than ever. For the fiancés of death in Santa Cruz, the preparations for the coup, according to a former member of the gang, came with a visit from Barbie. Quote, one day Klaus Altmann came to see us. That, of course, was Barbie's pseudonym when he was first in Latin America. One day Klaus Altmann came to see us. Quote, the moment has come, he said. We have to overthrow this government before Bolivia becomes another Cuba. With the other foreign comrades, we are getting together a security service. You have to cooperate. But first, you must be tested. We began to follow the union demonstrations, to keep files on the opposition, to threaten and punish subversives. We worked well. We even had a private prison for the torture, which we left, however, to the Bolivians. Their political advisor was Barbie's lawyer, Adolfo Ustares, who used to address the gang with the words, quote, we must kill all the communists, to which the group's commander would reply, quote, count on us, we are ready for everything. In La Paz, Barbie kept in touch with developments through a new friend, Emilio Carbone, C-A-R-B-O-N-E, an Italian neo-fascist in his 30s who had left Italy rather suddenly in 1970. After a period in Spain,
people died. That, from the New York Times of August 3rd, 1981, that's why it talks about last year. One Special Security Service trainer is former SS Commandant Albert von Ingelom, who served 20 years on a Nuremberg conviction. Other German Nazis from Altmann's contingent, 8 of them altogether, were arrested by Brazilian police for bringing 6 pounds of cocaine across the border. Also in their possession were a pair of machine guns and a pile of Nazi propaganda. So the extension of at least elements of the Recor mob, notably Klaus Barbie, a.k.a. Klaus Altmann, is worth noting here. We're going to take a look at the cocaine coup touched upon here by Jonathan Marshall in this essay. We're going to take a look at that coup, the role of Stefano Della Chiai in the Bridegrooms of Death, connections between that coup and the World Anti-Communist League, mentioned by Henrik Kruger, and the last thing we're going to take a look at is the role of U.S. intelligence in that coup.
Okay, we're going to read now from a book called The Nazi Legacy. The subtitle is Klaus Barbie, and the International Fascist Connection. It's copyright 1984 by Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. It's written by 3 authors: Magnus Linklater, Linklater, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Asherson, Asherson, The Nazi Legacy. I'm going to read a little bit more about Klaus Barbie and how the Bolivian Coca Fascista connection was set up. Dividing his time between Santa Cruz, his elegant house in Cochabamba, and his apartment in the Edificio Jazmín on Calle 20 Octubre in La Paz.
We're returning now to a publication that we've used a number of times in the past. This is Parapolitics. Parapolitics is a newsletter distributed by Jonathan Marshall to investigative reporters and political researchers. Marshall is currently the editorial page editor of the Oakland Tribune, formerly functioning in the same capacity for the San Jose Mercury News. In an essay in Parapolitics number 6 from the issue closing March 31st, 1982, Jonathan Marshall has authored an essay called The Business of Terrorism. And we're going to talk a little bit about the David Ricoeur mob and the collaboration with Klaus Barbie and the apparent extension of at least elements of that particular mob into the cocaine trade, and in turn we're going to take a look at the cocaine trade's close involvement with U.S. intelligence in the 1980 cocaine coup. Reading now from The Business of Terrorism by Jonathan Marshall in Parapolitics number 6. The French Connection, of which Lebanon was such an important part, was shifted to Latin America in the 1960s under the guiding eye of French and Italian fascists and criminals, including, as mentioned above, Tommaso Buscetta. Through Latin America, drugs could be moved with the help of corrupt governments and military administrations in the United States, evading tight customs controls or ports in the northeastern United States, evading tight customs controls on ports in the northeastern United States. The ring was ostensibly headed by Auguste Ricoeur, a former Nazi collaborator who relocated after World War II to Paraguay, where he was assisted by Nazi escapee Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who made his home in Bolivia. One of Ricoeur's closest assistants was Chrétien David, a former leader of the Gaullist strong-arm squad Service d'Action Civique that battled the OAS in Algeria and France in the early 1960s. SAC recruited heavily from the underworld, and David was one of those gangsters whose activities was sanctioned by the French state as long as he didn't overstep the bounds. But he was forced to flee to Latin America when, having been implicated in the political murder of Moroccan leftist Mehdi Ben Barka and in the shooting of a French police lieutenant, his political allies could no longer protect him. In Latin America, however, he kept in touch with his friends in the FOCAR network, and on behalf of local military intelligence agencies, infiltrated the Uruguayan Tupamaros guerrillas and fingered their leadership. Touring around the continent on an Argentine passport, he tried the same tactic in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. But David's real livelihood was crime, in particular trafficking in heroin. He was joined at the apex of the Ricoeur network by a former OAS henchman, Francois Chiappe, who, like David, now put politics aside. David and Chiappe were arrested in 1972 after the United States brought enormous pressure to bear on Latin regimes that harbored the traffickers. Interrupting, of course, we took a look at the hypocrisy in that pressure. That was the great heroin coup analyzed by Henrik Kruger. And, of course, the relationship between the people involved in that, the Nixon White House, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and the resulting right-wing terror triad, which Kruger calls the Miami conspiracy, we've just covered throughout the bulk of the broadcast. Continuing with Marshall's account, David was eventually extradited from Brazil to the United States, where he remains in prison. Chiappe, however, was mysteriously freed from prison by Argentine authorities just in time for him to take part in a military intelligence-sponsored massacre of left-wing Peronists at Azizia Airport in June of 1973. Chiappe became an enforcer for the right-wing Peronist Minister of Social Welfare, José López Rega, a P2 member, who ironically used U.S. military aid to entrench himself as Argentina's preeminent narcotics trafficker. One of López Rega's closest allies and the organizer of the Azizia massacre, Colonel Jorge Osinde, went on to become Argentina's ambassador to Paraguay, a nerve center of the French Connection. The French Connection, with its terrorist ties, lives on in Bolivia, home of the Bridegrooms of Death, a cocaine syndicate headed by former Gestapo boss Klaus Altmann, a.k.a. Barbie. Altmann, wanted for war crimes in France, is a close associate of Bolivian Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, who became Interior Minister following the notorious cocaine coup that the two men helped organize in 1980. Arce controls a fleet of private planes that he uses to move cocaine. He also commands a force of several hundred agents in the Special Security Service who divide their time between running drugs and torturing political prisoners. According to the New York Times, quote, reportedly aiding the colonel is a team of more than 20 foreign mercenaries from France, Italy, Belgium, Argentina, and other countries. Some of them say they are neo-Nazis. Last year, they helped establish and train the Special Security Service, which became the vanguard in storming government ministries and labor unions in last year's coup, in which more than 40